2:47 p.m., Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. The Senate chamber buzzed with a quiet tension. Staffers shuffled papers, interns hovered near coffee stations, and cameras rolled silently with their red record lights blinking like warnings. On the surface, it was just another hearing, but anyone paying attention could sense something else. Something brewing. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked in with her trademark composure, head high, shoulders squared, no papers in her hands. She didn't need them. Today wasn't about reading. It was about reminding. Across the room sat Senator JD Vance, arms folded, expression smug. He had a plan, and it wasn't just to debate policy. Today, he was going to try something more brutal. Make it personal. He believed that beneath Jasmine's poise was a weakness. Her family. And he was going to exploit it. Live on national television. The room quieted as Jasmine stepped toward the microphone. Her heels echoed in the marble hall like a countdown. She paused, took a breath, and looked straight at JD Vance. "Senator," she said, her voice even but unyielding, "we are here to speak on behalf of the people. But if you'd rather talk person to person, I'm right here." JD Vance smirked. Not a laugh, but the kind of smirk that said he believed he had already won. Reporters' fingers hovered above their keyboards. Something was about to happen, and they knew it. Then JD leaned into his mic, the tone in his voice shifting from casual to calculated. "You want to speak as an individual, Congresswoman? Fine. It's just... I find it fascinating how someone like you, coming from your kind of family, ends up in a place like this. What was it again? Your cousin did time? Or was it your uncle?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, heavy. Everyone in the room, aides, senators, press, felt it. The line had been crossed. Some looked down, others shifted in their seats, pretending not to hear what they just heard. But Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't look away. She simply stared back at JD Vance, unshaken. Not a flicker of emotion, just fire behind calm eyes. And in that moment, one thought crossed her mind. This is the moment you thought I'd go quiet. But this is when I begin. There was no rush in Jasmine's reply, no raised voice, no theatrical outburst. Instead, she leaned ever so slightly into her mic, held JD Vance's gaze, and said, "I'm glad you brought up my family, Senator, because now I get to talk about yours." The room jolted, not physically but emotionally. Everyone sat up. A few staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the camera crew paused, as if collectively thinking, "She's not backing down. She's going in." Jasmine's tone remained steady, almost surgical. "My cousin did serve time, yes. He was 17. He stole food for his sister. You want to talk about that? Let's talk about what desperation looks like when you've been abandoned by a system built to protect someone else's comfort." JD Vance's smirk faded, just a little. Jasmine didn't stop. "And let's talk about your family, Senator, the hedge fund ties, the private investments in prison labor, the policies that make sure kids like my cousin stay exactly where your donors want them, in a cage, not a classroom." Boom. The air cracked like a whip. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't rage. It was worse. It was truth. And truth, when calmly spoken, can sound louder than any shout. JD opened his mouth, slightly, but no words came. Jasmine kept going, this time looking directly into the camera, not at Vance. "This isn't about me or him. This is about every family you people try to shame into silence. Every kid who's been judged by the zip code he was born into. Every mother who's been told her son's mistake makes her unworthy of dignity." Then she turned back to JD. "You thought dragging my family into this would break me. What you forgot is... my family made me." A brief silence filled the room, but it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. JD Vance, for the first time in a long time, had nothing to say. JD Vance adjusted his tie. the move of a man who'd just been rocked, but was trying hard not to show it. He leaned forward toward the mic again, but this time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. Congresswoman Crockett, no one is questioning your personal story, but this isn't about anecdotes. This is about policy. This is about facts. It was a weak pivot, and Jasmine knew it, but she let him speak, let him twist. JD continued, bringing emotion into public discourse might earn applause, sure. But emotion doesn't build legislation. It doesn't secure borders. It doesn't solve the crime epidemic in communities like yours. There it was, that subtle shift from family to community, from a personal jab to a dog whistle. He was trying to move the narrative, blame, deflect, reframe her strength as overreaction, her pain as politics. But Jasmine had seen it all before. She waited for him to finish, then leaned forward again. Calm, deadly. Senator, you say emotion doesn't build legislation? Number, but compassion does. Integrity does. And your kind of policy, that's built on fear. The room bristled. You invoke my community like it's a threat. But let's talk about your community, Senator. A community of consultants, donors, and private equity wolves who've never missed a meal, but somehow always have opinions about people who have. JD's jaw clenched. Jasmine wasn't done. You want to talk about crime? Let's talk about corporate crime. Your donors move billions offshore and dodge accountability every day. But you want America to believe the biggest threat is a teenager caught with a joint. A murmur rolled through the back of the room. I don't bring emotion to the floor, Senator. I bring receipts. I bring names. I bring records. And if you're uncomfortable now, good. That means I'm finally speaking your language. For the first time, JD looked away. Not because he was defeated, because he was exposed. And Jasmine? She hadn't even raised her voice. The room had settled into an eerie stillness, the kind that only comes after the first hit lands clean. JD Vance was clearly reeling, but he still clung to the platform he had always relied on, control of the narrative, until Jasmine took it from him, with just one quote. She reached down, not for papers, but for memory. Do you remember what you said in 2016, Senator? I do. I remember it better than you probably do. JD's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. You said, people like Jasmine want to tear down the system because they never succeeded in it. Not privately, not behind closed doors. You said that on record, to a podcast, for all the world to hear. A low gasp moved through the chamber like a wave. JD Vance tried to interject, a hand gesture, a breath, but Jasmine cut in before he could spin. And then you ran for Senate, and suddenly you wanted to be the everyman's voice. You traded the truth for applause, you buried who you were, but I didn't forget. And more importantly, the people listening today won't either. She turned toward the press section, looked each reporter in the eye. So let's be clear. The man who just accused me of playing the victim is the same man who once mocked victims of opioid addiction, then built a campaign on their pain. JD Vance's face stiffened. Cameras zoomed in. Jasmine continued, each word more precise than the last. You call my story emotional? No, Senator. My story is accountable. Yours is edited. JD reached for his notes. Something, anything, to grip onto, but it was too late. This isn't a debate anymore. This is a reckoning, and you're not just losing the argument, you're losing the room. As she spoke those final words, the camera panned across the chamber. Silent heads, locked eyes. No one, not even his own side, came to his defense. And JD Vance, once so composed, now looked like a man who had wandered into a storm without an umbrella, not realizing Jasmine Crockett was the storm. JD Vance's voice came through the mic again, this time sharper, desperate. You want to talk about my past statements, fine. But let's not pretend you've always been transparent either, Congresswoman. I mean, we could talk about your brother, couldn't we? Or your father's arrest record? A collective inhale filled the chamber. No one had expected he'd go there. Not in public, not with the cameras rolling. It wasn't policy anymore. It wasn't politics. It was personal warfare. Jasmine inhaled slowly, Her eyes didn't waver. She stepped forward. Yes. Let's talk about my father, a Vietnam veteran who came back to a country that forgot him. A man who was arrested for a nonviolent offense because the world gave him trauma and then punished him for trying to survive it. She turned, now facing the public gallery, not JD. You think you can shame me by saying his name? I honor his name. Every single day I sit in this seat, I carry what he couldn't finish. Then she pivoted, hard, back toward JD Vance. But since we're talking about family, let's talk about yours. Not your blood, your donor family. You know, the billionaires who bankroll your every campaign, including a hedge fund that owns private prisons in 5 states? JD tried to speak. Jasmine raised a hand, not aggressively, but commandingly. Don't interrupt me, Senator. You wanted to talk families? Let's talk about how your political family profits from incarcerating mine. Silence. Dead silence. You lecture me about accountability while cashing checks from people who build cages for profit. And you call that policy? Number, that's exploitation dressed up in a suit. A journalist in the back started typing furiously. The press table lit up with movement. Jasmine walked a few steps forward, each one deliberate. You brought my family into this to humiliate me, but I brought your backers into this to expose you. She paused. And the difference is simple, Senator. My family never bought me. Yours owns you. That line hit like a detonation. JD Vance sat frozen, a cocktail of rage and realization behind his eyes. His weapon, family, had not only misfired, it had blown up in his hands. And Jasmine, she wasn't done. She was just getting warmed up. Jasmine stood still for a moment, not in hesitation, but in strategy. The room was quiet, holding its breath. JD Vance avoided her eyes now. He could feel the walls tightening. But Jasmine wasn't going to rush this. Truth, when dropped at the right moment, didn't need volume. It needed precision. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it between her fingers like it was a scalpel. You like to talk about crime, Senator, she said. But let's talk about intent. You've called entire communities lawless. But I want to play something today that shows us what lawlessness sounds like when it wears a tie. She gestured toward a staffer behind her, who immediately walked over to the desk near the control board. A few beeps, a few clicks, and then a voice came through the speakers. JD Vance's voice. It was him, unmistakably, calm, cocky, recorded. We don't need to win over everyone. We just need to make sure the people who write the checks feel like we're on their side. The rest, they'll follow if they're scared enough. A wave of reaction surged through the chamber. Audible gasps, reporters spinning toward each other. Even some of Vance's allies dropped their pens. JD Vance's face turned pale. The audio kept playing. We play the patriot card in the South, the family values card in the Midwest, and the fear card in the cities. That's how you win. Not with truth, with timing. The audio cut off. Jasmine let the silence linger. Then she spoke, low and clear. That was you, Senator. That was a fundraiser in Cleveland, March 2022. Private room, closed doors, but truth doesn't stay locked up forever. JD opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Jasmine took one step forward. You accuse me of playing emotional politics while you stand in front of your voters and say whatever your donors need you to say. That's not politics. That's performance. She turned to the cameras again. Let the record show. He threatened my family. He tried to shame my story. But now, his own voice is doing the damage. And then, her final strike for the day. Senator Vance, you came here to put on a show. I came here to pull the curtain back. As she sat down, the entire room stayed still, frozen in the aftermath. JD Vance stared ahead, lips tight, hands locked. He had walked in confident. Now he looked like a man watching his own career play on a screen, and realizing too late he wasn't the narrator anymore. By the time Jasmine stepped out of the Senate chamber, the story had already gone viral. Clips of her calmly exposing JD Vance, from his donor ties to the secret fundraiser recording, were already trending across platforms. On TikTok, the caption read, "She brought facts. He brought shame." On Twitter, This is what real leadership sounds like. And on cable news, anchors used one word more than any other: staggering. Inside Vance's office, the mood was apocalyptic. His chief of staff stood frozen in front of a muted TV screen, watching a split screen of Jasmine's takedown and his boss's stunned expression. Assistants whispered about polling data. One aide muttered, "We're hemorrhaging support in Columbus." JD Vance stood near the window, staring out as though the city had turned against him. And maybe it had. "I want a counterstatement drafted," he barked. "Blame the audio. Say it was manipulated." His communications director shook her head. "It won't work. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She revealed. That's why it's landing." Meanwhile, Jasmine was sitting in a modest studio, ready to go live on a grassroots news stream. No spin, no teleprompter. "You know, they said I was too emotional to lead," she began. "But funny how the facts make people uncomfortable when they come from someone like me." She looked directly into the camera, not at her supporters, but at the undecided, the skeptical, the silent majority. "This isn't about me versus him. It's about what happens when people like JD Vance think they're untouchable. They use family as a weapon. They use fear as a policy. But I believe in a different kind of politics, one that doesn't need to hide behind dark rooms and quiet deals." The comment section erupted in real time. "She's the only one actually telling the truth. No theatrics, just courage. Vance is done. This is career ending." And Jasmine? She just smiled softly, not out of victory, but clarity. Meanwhile, in the back halls of Capitol Hill, a junior staffer rushed up to Vance's chief advisor. "Sir, there's a petition going viral, 150,000 signatures in 2 hours. They're demanding an ethics investigation." JD Vance's hands clenched at his sides. The one weapon he thought he could wield, Jasmine's family, had become the very thing exposing his own weakness. He had nothing real to stand on. The next morning, the Senate reconvened. On paper, it was a routine session, but the tension in the chamber was anything but routine. JD Vance walked in first, but the power he once carried with every step was gone. His usual allies, the ones who'd slap him on the back, offer sly smirks, or echo his attacks, now avoided eye contact. One senator quietly slid a folder over his phone screen to hide a news headline: "Vance implodes on live TV." Across the room, Jasmine Crockett entered, alone in posture, but not in presence. Staffers nodded as she passed. Even those who once dismissed her now watched her with something closer to respect, or fear. The Senate Majority Leader gavelled the room to order. Then, something unexpected happened. A Republican senator, gray-haired, known more for silence than speeches, cleared his throat. "Mr. President, before we proceed, I feel compelled to say something." Heads turned. "I've served in this chamber for nearly 2 decades, and in that time, I've seen passion, even conflict. But yesterday, I saw something else. I saw a colleague weaponize personal trauma for political gain, and I won't defend it." JD Vance's head snapped up. The senator continued. "Congresswoman Crockett did what far too few do in this room. She told the truth, calmly, relentlessly, and with facts. And while we may disagree on policy, I can't in good conscience ignore what we all witnessed." Gasps didn't come this time. Just a heavy, unmistakable shift in the room. Another senator, this time a Democrat, leaned forward and said, "She didn't just hold her ground, she raised the ground we all stand on." Jasmine remained seated, hands folded. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Because she knew what this was. Not a celebration. A turning point. JD Vance, trying to salvage something, anything, stood and said, "Let's not forget, this is still about accountability. I have always stood for integrity." He stopped mid-sentence, because as he spoke, a Senate staffer entered the chamber and handed a note to the presiding officer. The room fell silent as the gavel tapped twice. "Mr. President," the clerk said, "we've received official notice. The Senate Ethics Committee is launching a formal inquiry into Senator Vance's financial disclosures and campaign fundraising activities. JD froze. The walls were no longer closing in, they were collapsing. Jasmine? She sat still, not victorious but vindicated, not loud but undeniable. And for the first time since this confrontation began, the room, once tilted in Vance's favor, now stood entirely still, watching her. The screen faded in. JD Vance, seated in a well-lit studio, hands clasped, brow furrowed with a carefully crafted mix of regret and control. The interview was live. The stakes couldn't have been higher. "I want to say," he began, voice low and deliberately slow, "that my words, during that hearing, they came from a place of frustration, not malice. I have deep respect for Congresswoman Crockett, and I apologize if my comments were taken as personal. If were taken." Social media exploded in seconds. Hashtags erupted. "Not an apology." JD backpedals. Crockett crushed. Jasmine was already scheduled for a town hall that night. But after Vance's broadcast, the viewership doubled, then tripled. Local news affiliates cut their regular programming to broadcast her live. She didn't even need a podium. She walked onto the small stage, looked directly into the camera, and said, "He said, if my comments were taken as personal. Let me make this very clear. My family isn't a misunderstanding. They're not a PR inconvenience. They're my strength, and they deserve better than a half-scripted apology crafted by lawyers." The crowd clapped, but Jasmine raised a hand, not to silence them, but to keep the message sharp. Senator Vance wants to pretend that this was about emotions running high, that maybe, just maybe, he went too far with his words. But the problem isn't the words, it's the strategy behind them. You don't accidentally bring up someone's family on national TV. You don't slip up with a private audio recording about scaring voters. She paused, scanning the room, speaking directly to the people now watching across the country. This wasn't a moment, this was a pattern, and America is finally catching the pattern. Reporters' phones buzzed nonstop as Jasmine continued. "I don't want his apology. I want accountability. And so do the people who've watched leaders like him manipulate fear for gain, then play innocent when they get caught." Then came the moment, the one that would be clipped, shared, and replayed across every platform. "You can't scare me with shame, because I was raised in it, and I turned it into power. You can't silence me with family, because mine taught me to speak. And you can't defeat me on live TV, because I don't need to perform, I just need to show up." That line sent the room into a quiet, heavy, standing ovation. Not cheering, respect. Even mainstream networks who once downplayed her voice now led their evening segments with one headline: "Jasmine Crockett doesn't demand respect, she earns it and then redefines it." 2 weeks later, Capitol Hill felt different. The JD Vance name that once rang with defiance and dominance now echoed with something colder: disgrace. The Ethics Committee report had gone public. The leaked fundraiser tape? Verified. 3 major donors pulled out. And most damning of all, Senate leadership quietly stripped him of his subcommittee chair. The blow wasn't loud. It was surgical. The power he'd once wielded in every room now vanished the moment he entered them. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett walked those same halls, not with arrogance, but with gravity. You could feel it, in how the cameras turned, in how staffers leaned in how reporters no longer asked if she had a comment. They waited for her to set the tone. On the floor of the House, she gave one last address, not as revenge, not as a final jab, but as a moment of national clarity. We've all watched leaders use fear as their currency. We've seen families, like mine, dragged into darkness, while the ones doing the dragging get applause for being tough. But toughness isn't cruelty, and leadership isn't a microphone. It's what you do with it when no one claps. The room was silent. I didn't survive that attack to win a moment. I stood firm because I know who I am, and no senator, no smear, no studio camera will ever rewrite that. Later that night, JD Vance tried to hold a press event. Only a handful of cameras showed up. He read from a script, standing behind a podium with no flags, no cheering crowd. It was over. Jasmine, on the other hand, returned to Texas, but not quietly. She was invited on national town halls. Her quotes were on posters. Her stance was taught in civics classrooms, and more importantly, a movement grew behind her. Young people, single mothers, veterans, formerly incarcerated voters. They didn't see a politician. They saw one of their own who refused to bow, even when the target on her back included her name, her story, and her family. And in the final frame of this storm, Jasmine Crockett walks down a hallway, past the portraits of old men who once believed they owned the rules. She doesn't slow down, because now she writes them. I didn't come here today to win a headline. I didn't show up to trade insults or play games with someone's carefully rehearsed cruelty. I came here because I believe in something bigger than politics. I believe in the truth. I believe in dignity. I believe that no one's family, not mine, not yours, should be used as a weapon to score cheap applause on live television. Pauses, looks out across the room. You see, Senator Vance thought I would break. He thought if he brought my father's name into this, or dragged my brother's story onto the floor, that I would fold. But what he didn't understand is that I was raised in fire. I don't fear shame. I've lived through it. I don't hide from struggle. I was shaped by it. Leans into the mic slightly. So, the next time someone thinks about weaponizing my story, they better be ready to have their own exposed, because this isn't about silencing me. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong in the room, every family that's ever been painted as a liability instead of a legacy, and every child watching this, wondering if the system has a place for them. Pauses. Slow, final sentence. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I didn't fall. And if you thought this was the end of my story, you haven't been listening at all.